History's a funny old thing. I have to say, history really is. Because if you consider some of the questions that get asked today about World War II piece of equipment, mostly World War II piece of equipment, mostly things which were needed in a global world war, you would think people haven't actually looked at the reasons why they were needed in the first place. So this is the conception, operation, and conclusion of the Atlantic Conveyor and other rapid conversions. I added it into this month because, honestly, I wasn't sure where to put it. If I put it to the end of the year for late Cold War, after all, 1982 is late Cold War, then it was going to miss out quite a large chunk of it. But if I try to do conversions without the Atlantic Conveyor, it wasn't going to make sense. So it's now at this point of the year. It's in, roughly speaking, the interwar period. And it suits being an interwar period because that's the start of the situation. You see, prior to the Washington Naval Treaty and all the other treaties, what countries used to do, this is going to sound revolutionary, is they didn't make big statements that they were going to spend 2.5% on defense, or this amount on defense, or that amount of defense. They didn't make statements that they were going to be the most defended nation, adjusted for inflation since the Visigoths. Didn't do anything like that. No, what they did was they looked at their needs and they funded them according to their ability and their want. And that was it. If they felt they needed a load of small ships to be their present ships around the world, they built them. As long as the government was prepared to fund it, that's what they did. The literal limitation was what governments were prepared to fund. There was nothing for them to artificially hit. They weren't doing any comparisons with anyone else. They weren't doing, oh, this fits this nation, so therefore it's what we should do. No, every nation treated itself as an individual, as a nation which has made up of its own unique peoples, unique interests, unique advantages and disadvantages, and responded accordingly. And that's scary. That is scary when you start looking at it in terms of the modern world. Because you start looking around the modern world and you go, is there any nation's defense debate which is so rote? Is there any nation's defense debate which is all about what their interests are, what their needs are, what they require their capabilities to be, versus an artificial debate about what they're spending versus another nation, what cool weapon one nation's got, what they haven't got, all these things. Defense debates, when they do happen in most nations, tend to be around these titular titles of things like hypersonics. They're always a popular thing to bring up. But fast missiles have been something we've been dealing with for years and thinking about for years. It's doable when it's coming directly for you or for your task group. It's a little bit more complicated when it's going across your horizon rather than through your horizon. That makes it a little bit more difficult. It's the same with most modern submarines, drones, all these things. I have fun when people tell me, oh, it's completely new. Drones are something completely new. And I go, well, they had radio-controlled glide bombs in World War II. The British and several other nations had radio-controlled aircraft in the 1930s, which they used for their AA gunfire testing, anti-aircraft fire testing. This technology is new in that it's visible to us now, but it's been coming for a long time. But I think the difference is if you try and get funding to be prepared for this technology, and you go and talk to politicians, or you go and talk to the leadership of your country about it, they're going, "Oh, you're just inflating things. You're just inflating the threat." And then when it's suddenly spread across the news, they're suddenly going, "Why haven't you got anything ready for this?" And usually the armed forces have. They just don't have a lot of it ready because they've been allowed to have it, because it's been dressed up as a new technology, as something fancy and cool to invest in. But they haven't been allowed to get a lot of it because, well, that would be expensive, and honestly, the threat's not really there. Think about how many countries stopped taking the threat of war seriously in 1990. Think about how many countries stopped believing that. But the thing is, a lot of those same countries, for a very different reason, hoped that wars had stopped turning up in 1919. And this was despite many of them still being involved in fighting a war at the time. But it was a long way away. Someone else's problem. The fact that it could spread to you didn't matter. That is easier to deal with when it's a long way away. The fact that it's going to destabilize the world for the next 80 to 100 years doesn't matter. It was over. The wars were over. I've always loved people who can believe the human nature is going to change and we are going to have peace and love and harmony. I always love their ideals. They're such nice people. They're really hoping for the best in the world. I hate people who use that as their basis for their strategic thinking and their defense procurement and assessment. I despise people who use that as the basis for their development of a foreign and diplomatic service and intelligence service. Because, on one hand, it's really good when you're not the one making decisions about where to spend government money, and you're not the one, taxpayers' money, let's be honest, not government money, it's taxpayers' money, and you're not the one making the decision about this, that, or the other. It's a nice thing to have. It's a really nice thing to have. They're nice people to talk to. But the trouble is, when you're governing a nation, when you are given that responsibility, you have to deal with and prepare for the world as is, not as you would wish or dream or hope it to be. Now, why am I giving this introduction to this discussion? Because honestly, these kind of conversions should never have existed. I know someone's going to say, well, what about the seaplane carriers in World War I? That's because seaplane carriers were a concept which had only just started coming into service and into existence prior to World War I, and the quickest way to get them into service was to convert and modify ships. But honestly, aircraft carriers, forward aviation support ships, aviation logistics ships, are nothing new by the time you get to World War II, and are certainly not new by the time you get to the Falklands War. And yet they still exist, and the reason they exist is because of the lack of funding, because of the lack of preparedness, because it wasn't necessary. Due to treaty, or due to alliance, due to all these things. Oh, we don't need that because we'll always fight with our allies and it'll always be in area. We don't need that because treaty means that we can't have it and no one else is going to have enough problems, enough strength to cause us problems, so that doesn't matter. Even when the treaty system has broken down, well, you see, we've spent the last 6 years trying to pay for infrastructure to close, etc., to move the economy forward. This is just in Britain alone, but it's not only Britain. We really don't want to have to pay to reopen that same infrastructure we just closed. Besides, some of it we literally closed by act through Parliament and things. Yeah. Planning. And that's the reality. I'm going to talk you through these ships, so I hope you will enjoy the discussion of them. But the thing you should be remembering and thinking about the entire way through the discussion is they should never have come to be. They should never have been necessary. Maybe the escort carriers. When you're expanding your aviation that quickly, that rapidly, and the capabilities that quickly and that rapidly, yeah, a merchant build hull is something. But they aren't a conversion. They are a build. They were built as that. The fact that there wasn't, and when I say there wasn't, officially there wasn't plans available to go, ready to go, to do these to do the builds of escort carriers, distresses me. The fact there wasn't officially conversion plans, although it's one of those things where, as I've talked about when I talked about Mac ships in that video, you will find it's kind of an interesting history. There are many people who claim to be the genius creationist behind Mac ships. So much so you go earlier and earlier and earlier and you go, But today the Mac ships aren't the topic of conversation, because as I said, they've already had a key ships. So they're going to get mentioned and they're going to get discussed, but they're not going to get the full overview. There's a whole video about them. This is about cam ships. About the concepts and needs behind Mac ships and escort carriers. And about the Atlantic Conveyor. This today is about all that. And if you've been wondering is my thumb stitched up, I would just say be very careful when you're moving house, because, well, it's not stitched, it's heavily bandaged up, because you can get your thumb, in this case, crushed by a very heavy doorway, which has a surprisingly sharp edge, which decided to cut it the entire way down. So before anyone wonders about it too much, yes. Door stopper with sharp edge. Dropped on thumb when I was on the floor moving something else. Life happens. Shameless book plug. We always have it because, well, thank you to everyone who supports the channel, who likes the channel, who shares the channel, who subscribes to the channel, who is a supporter on Patreon, Ko-fi, and there's currently Patreon suggestions for June is live right now, or a member of the channel. Thank you to everyone who does that. The reason I always do the Shameless book plug, one reason, my book's out and I really love it and I want as many people to read it as possible. And secondly, I'm an academic, as it says in the title, and sadly enough, universities do not promote based on your view count on YouTube, or your number of subscribers, or your number of videos and topics you covered, or the comments people left. Although those things are all incredibly appreciated by me, and thank you for doing them. And they really do help the channel, so thank you. They promote you, they hire you based on how many books you sell, so shameless book plug it is. So let's start off by talking about cam ships. Probably, let's be honest, one of the most dangerous ships to work on if you're a pilot during World War II. And honestly, not that fun for some of the crew or the ship either if they take off and they don't realise they're going to go, because those rockets were not fun to be near. They really weren't. So, the target of these ships was not submarines. It was the Focke-Wulf Condors. Yeah, those lovely aircraft that told the submarines where you were. This actually does bring back an entirely different, interesting idea, because, of course, if we were considering a modern world, a modern scenario of warfare, well, what could be telling a submarine where you are? Well, once you get past the claims that various nations have that their sonar is so good that it can listen to other people doing things across the other side of insert name of ocean here, yeah, sonar is now a lot more advanced than it used to be. The passive sonar especially. They have a lot of very advanced computer systems which allow them to sift through a lot of data and a lot of different data points, more importantly, and detect at very long range. So the submarines themselves can do quite a lot of long range detection. And then, of course, you have satellites and aircraft. Do I think any of those scenarios are going to suggest for a repeating of this? No, because let's be honest, if you are going to shoot down a satellite, you're going to need a lot more than just a rocket-based catapult system chucking an old Hurricane off into the air to hopefully engage the Condor before it eventually crashes into the sea. The Hurricane, that is. The Condor may or may not crash into the sea. It depends on how lucky the Hurricane pilot is. Sometimes they were called Hurricats, sometimes they were called Catafighters. They were pretty much, I would say, end of life, but theoretically, what I'm supposed to say, near end of life aircraft, which the Royal Air Force really didn't think were going to work. And, well, they did. But they only had to work once. That's the thing. They only had to work once. And in fact, combat launches of them, because they were pretty much a one-way mission for the aircraft, were rare. But when they were used, the SS Empire Foam used one on the 1st of November 1941. That was the first time they were used. The pilot was then recovered by HMS Broke after he chased off the Focke-Wulf F-200. Didn't shoot it down, but Flying Officer Varley did a good job. On the 26th of April 1942, SS Empire Morn, as part of Convoy QP-12, launched Flying Officer J.B. Kendall. They chased off a Blom & Voss BV-138, and there was a Ju-88 shot down. Unfortunately, Kendall died from injuries received while bailing out, because the whole idea was the pilots would bail out and the aircraft would crash into the sea. You're starting to see potentially why these aircraft were launching and was considered such a big decision to make. Let's be honest, these ships were actually fully civilian. They might have been Empire ships, many of them, which were technically operated by the Ministry of War, owned by the Ministry of War, or rather, Ministry of War Transport, the subsection. They had a civilian master and the merchant ship fighter unit from the Royal Air Force, who were the pilots of the aircraft, were all signed on as civilian members under the authority of that master. The ship's chief engineer became responsible for the catapult and its maintenance. The first mate acted as the catapult duty officer, i.e. that's the ship's XO, responsible for firing the catapult when directed. And, well, the Hurricane fighter would only be launched when enemy aircraft was sighted and agreement was reached using hand and flag signals between the pilot, the CDO, and the ship's master. The CDO, of course, being the catapult duty officer, being the first mate, i.e. the ship's executive officer, for want of a better expression to describe it. Each crew of personnel for a ship supplied by the merchant ship fighter unit included a fitter, a rigger, a radio telephone operator, a fighter direction officer, a seaman torpedoman, and of course a pilot. When it was voyages to Russia or through the Mediterranean, it was usually 2 pilots, but also to Gibraltar across the Bay of Biscay was 2 pilots. But usually it's just 1 pilot if it's across the Atlantic. And well, it keeps going on, you know. These things are very much integrated into their civilian counterpart, into the civilian service, the merchant marine. But they're also their own unit. So it's a interesting organisation to have aboard these merchant ships, and you're giving a lot of power and a lot of trust to a merchant captain. Next one was the SS Empire Lawrence, where it was PQ-16 and pilot officer Hay, who flew up to shoot down 2 Hankel 111s. The Hurricane itself was shot down, though, and the pilot was wounded and recovered by HMS Volunteer. Always nice when a World War I W-class destroyer turns up to pick you up. And by the way, HMS Brooke earlier was also a World War I destroyer. Again, this is something to consider when we're talking about the infrastructure scenario. Britain retained a lot of its World War I destroyers, thankfully, because they provided a lot of the convoy escorts. But again, that's something we often don't really discuss as much about the realities of preparing for war and about a global war. 14th of June 1942, SS Empire Moon, a part of Convoy HG-84 with Pilot Officer Sanders, chased off a Focke-Wulf F-200. The pilot was recovered by HMS Stork, which of course was a Bittern-class sloop. 18th of September 1942, SS Empire Moon, Flying Officer A.H. Burr. 2 Hankel Treble 1s destroyed. The pilot managed to fly to Russia, the Keg Ostrov Aerodrome, and land there successfully. 1st of November 1942, SS Empire Heath of Convoy HG-91, Flying Officer N. Taylor, shot down a Focke-Wulf FW-200. Pilot nearly drowned before recovery. 28th of July 1943, SS Empire Dawn, Convoy SL-133, Flying Officer J.A. Stewart. The Focke-Wulf FW-200 was destroyed. The pilot was recovered by HMS Leaf, which of course was a Grimsby-class sloop. 28th of July 1943, also MV Empire Tide, Convoy SL-133. You're noting the theme here? Pilot Officer P.J.R. Flynn. The Focke-Wulf W-200 was destroyed, but this pilot was recovered by HMS Enchantress, which of course was another Bittern-class sloop, which had originally started life as actually being the name for the class, but, well, she was decided that she was going to be a yacht for an admiral, so her name was changed from Bittern to Enchantress, and number 2 of the class was named Bittern, and Enchantress ends up being fitted out as a yacht to start off with, and then converted to full war sloop when war began. The Royal Navy also had some fighter catapult ships, and those vessels were ever so slightly different. We'll cover that in a bit, but we'll mention their experiences now because it's worthwhile considering in the full. There was the 18th of July 1941 launch from HMS Maplin by Lieutenant R. Everett, Royal Navy Volunteer Reserve, who flew off and was just about in position to attack the Focke-Wulf Condor, and the Condor was promptly shot down by a ship's anti-aircraft guns. So Everett flew to Northern Ireland, landed at RAF St Angelo. On the 3rd of August 1941, it was Everett again launching from Maplin, this time for Convoy OG-17, and this time he was not frustrated. He did not have a permanent case of "Ah!" Instead, he shot down the Focke-Wulf FW-200, and he was recovered by a destroyer, possibly going, "Finally!" Just imagine that. You've gone through all the thing of launching in a hurricane. A hurricane which is frankly falling apart already. You have positioned yourself to intercept. You have positioned yourself to do your duty successfully. And the aircraft literally gets shot down in front of you. You're just going, I've got it, I've got it, I've got it. You know, all the adrenaline, all the energy, all the things in you, and it's just, yeah. A better man than me. Definitely a better man than me. But of course, he was a famous British jockey as well, so he won the Grand National at some point in 1929. He'd won the Grand National. So, even more likely to be frustrated. Jockeys are almost always the most enthusiastic. So, the other vessels involved in that conversion, by the way, were Aragani, as well as Maplan, Pasha, Pegasus, and Springbank. If Pegasus, you're sitting there going, hang on, I've heard Pegasus a lot before. That's because that is the name that by this point was ascribed to the former seaplane carrier, HMS Ark Royal, which had been the first ever seaplane carrier to be built from scratch, and therefore technically perhaps the first purpose-built aircraft carrier, but she's a seaplane carrier, so we'll go on that. Which had been renamed Pegasus in 1934. She was used as a seaplane training vessel. But in 1940, along with the other vessels, she was converted to a fighter catapult ship, which, well, they were each equipped with either a Fairey Fulmar or a Hawker Hurricane Mark 1A or Hurricat or various other things they called them as said. They're all basically former ocean boarding vessels, various other things, but two of them, Patia and Springbank, were actually lost in the war. Springbank to U-201. She was torpedoed by U-201. She ends up having to be sunk and finished off by HMS Jasmine. Sometimes these things are necessary. And Pasha was founded after a bombing attack. Sadly enough. But these ships were all sort of in the naval category to convert, so that's why I haven't used them as merchant conversions. Let's be honest, Pegasus is definitely a naval ship, and the others are all ocean boarding vessels, which were merchant ships taken over by the Royal Navy, but they'd already been worked out and selected prior to the war. So they've taken something which has already been converted into a Royal Navy asset, and then are converting it again. So it's a conversion of a conversion. It's not making the decision to go, we're taking this ship out of civilian service to convert it. No, it's, we already have this ship, we might as well make use of it in this way as well. It's a slightly different barrier for entry. And again, you might notice there are no pictures of a fighter catapult ship here. I was interested in trying to find one, but finding a picture of them in that form is pretty much impossible. Sad enough. Even the pictures I could find of HMS Pegasus during World War II didn't really show it. I was considering maybe not, but no, it's not really that scenario. Now, all the Empire ships, as said, were all war transport ministry. Okay, that's who was operating them, as can be considered their owners, although some of them were owned through interesting means. So, and I don't want to spend my time getting into those details, but there was all sorts of systems in place. The reality of the CAM ships, though, is there are 35 of those used. 5 fighter catapult ships, so roughly 40 of pretty much the same thing. Then there's 19 MAC ships, And compared to all of that is roughly 124 escort carriers. So the thing is, even in a world war, the merchant conversions, a world war which was massive, which was taking up resources left, right, and centre, the merchant conversions were in many ways about buying time to get, okay, merchant build ships into service, but to get the specialist ships into service. And let's be honest, if you have to pick what you're operating from, and out of these options, an escort carrier is far better than a CAM or an FCS. Let's be honest, the Max ship is. Some of them might be preferable. Some of them they're probably preferable to the others. You can land back aboard. That is an advantage. But let's be honest, the escort carriers are by far the pick of the bunch. And what's really interesting when you consider all of this, especially in the case of the Royal Navy, which had worked with HMS Argus, which was herself, let's be honest, a converted merchant ship into what would be equivalent in World War II to an escort carrier. World War One was slightly more useful for various other roles, as its air group was enough for those other roles at that time. But by World War II, it's pretty much escort carrier level. In fact, slightly small for escort carrier level in a way. The fact is, the Royal Navy didn't start this program until war had begun. They'd experimented with the ideas, they'd worked on the designs. As I've alluded to before, they'd realised the problem, and so did the US Navy, and so did the Japanese Navy. Let's be honest, the Japanese have a whole load of ships which are basically built to be converted. The Americans, one of the first things they're doing when looking at the designs of hulls for their rapid build merchant ship program is, are those hulls viable for escort carrier roles? Are those viable hulls to convert into that duty? Can they do that mission? It's worthwhile thinking about. There are requirements for that mission. Often the easiest way to stop a super weapon or a wonder weapon or any enemy capability from working is to start by stopping it being able to find you. This was something I was trying to allude to or discuss at the beginning. If you don't have necessarily the weapons to provide enough kill capability against the enemy's weapon should it be actually be in use, stop it being able to be used. All these ships, up to the point you get to the escort carriers, are far more concerned with taking out condors than they are taking out submarines. The fact that some are sunk by submarines is not surprising. They are not anti-submarine warfare vessels. The Max ships, to an extent, they will carry anti-submarine warfare aircraft, and they will use them, and they will do their patrols, and that is certainly an advantage of them. But even the first escort carriers, they were about taking out the condors, especially in the Bay of Biscay, stopping the German aircraft from being able to report the position of the convoys to the submarines. Because the submarines can't wolfpack against what they don't know. It's also a great way of covering up for things like Ultra, the decryption of German signals, or the signals traffic analysis that was revealing so much about what the Germans were up to. Those sorts of information, you didn't want the Germans understanding that. Well, if you took out the enemy search aircraft, there's a good reason. Oh, well, of course we haven't found the convoys. We don't know we haven't got the good data about the convoys are. None of the search aircraft have reported back. They must have been taken out. Everything you do in this regard adds plausible deniability. Adds another reason for the enemy to think, well, that's a logical reason for it. Because there's going to be a lot of very logical thinkers in your command structure and the enemy command structure, and they're going to sit there and go, well, what's a logical reason, a sensible reason, not a conspiracy theory reason, for why we haven't found this convoys? Well, none of our search aircraft have returned home. Or the search aircraft which returned home was chased off by a fighter. And so they lost contact with the convoy and couldn't give the necessary bearings and points of reference for us to actually successfully home in on them. So why is this not surprising, though? Why are these systems understood before war begins? What's the basis for that point of view? Well, because the world then wasn't as different from the world today as we might like to presume. It was just as global. It was just as integrated. Admittedly, the size of the ships was a lot smaller, but proportionally, the sheer quantity of trade wasn't quite as much in terms of sheer quantity as we're doing today. It was a lot more ships, though. Today we have gone for ever bigger and bigger ships, and honestly, unless the forces of economics and our understanding of economics changes, that is not going to be something which is going to change altogether anytime soon. In fact, I have heard all the recent discussions about whether or not America should expand on their ports and infrastructure to take the latest and greatest size of container ships, and I agree they should do. But be prepared, the fact that those won't be the largest container ships forever. Bigger ones will come. And I can guarantee, with people currently keep having to avoid the Middle East because of issues in the Suez Canal and the various issues in the Red Sea, etc., that have been going on over the last couple of years, I am sure someone is doing the maths and calculations for how big does a container ship need to be to make going around Africa as a regular part of its trip as economically viable as going through the Suez Canal. And I can guarantee you someone is doing those sums. Why are therefore all these ships necessary, though? Because of that trade. Why does that trade require this level of ships, this level of coverage? Well, because you have to cover that much of the world. I had a lot of fun, regular people who stand up and go, well, the important thing for modern Royal Navy or modern US Navy or modern is to be able to do something like the North Atlantic convoys again. And I go, okay, so what about the South Atlantic convoys? Are they not necessary? The Indian Ocean convoys, the Mediterranean convoys. If you literally think that in any global war, all you will be doing is convoying across the North Atlantic, you have got your understanding of World War II naval warfare from the movies, at best. At worst, the back of some not particularly great fiction novels. Yes, Arctic convoys were a thing, but so were Caribbean convoys. Yes, the North Atlantic was an absolutely bitter ground, but so was the South Atlantic and the convoys across the Bay of Biscay. If you look at this map, if you actually look at it, and you look at the sheer quantity of ships, that those dots all represent ships of a certain size, look at the big, thick stream that runs down through the Bay of Biscay. Look at where it flows. And I could show you a modern global map, and that's exactly the same. Yes, transatlantic trade will matter. Yes, transatlantic flow of goods will matter. And yes, in any major war, the global economy, as we know it, will not be running the same way, and those routes will not be going the same way. But the thing is, do you think the goods will be chopped off at the end of that stream? Because the way container ships work, they do multiple port visits along the way. They might start off in China and then go to Singapore and then on to India and then from India go to Mediterranean to maybe Italy or Greece and then go to Spain and then go to Britain and then go to Netherlands and then start the route all the way back again, go again to Britain, all the way. It's more like a bus route than is the idea of a constant passage between 2 points. So when we start talking about global trade and start thinking about global trade, there's a lot of nodes along that route which need to be serviced. And even a war between the worst kind of war we could imagine, a war with Russia, China, and America involved against each other. Even that, it might not cut off trade for all those points. The trade might be still running. The trade might be necessary. The British don't have the Singapore free sterling zone for the good of their health or because they love it. They don't have that sort of area set up in Malaysia and these things during World War II for the fun of it. They do it because it's necessary to try and keep their economy going, to help them with servicing their debts, to help them with raising more debts, to help them with all the functioning parts of the war economy. And to buy them time to transition, because remember, they had not shifted their economy over to a war economy in 1939. By the time war started, because war hadn't started and they're a democracy. The shifted over to a wartime economy is going to put your economy immediately at a disadvantage against peacetime economies in peacetime. It does. It means economic growth, it also means research growth will get completely trashed as everything is focused on maximizing production. Or at least it should be if it's done properly. That's the criteria. It should be if it's done properly. So the reality was, you had to cover a lot of the world. And you didn't have a lot of bases you could do a lot of air patrols from. You didn't have a lot of aircraft to do air patrols with. And even where you did have bases and did have aircraft, that's not the same as being able to have the aircraft with you. And the whole reason for an aircraft carrier, and I know there are so many people who get so involved in this topic. Let me explain. An aircraft carrier is there to service the aircraft and to provide their capabilities of air power, of organic air power, to a task group or naval force on a maneuver. The reason you need that is because whilst we might be able to refuel aircraft in the air, we can do that. It's very intensive and you need a lot of tankers to be able to do it, something which is also in short supply in the modern world. You can't rearm them in the air. You can't fix any problems they might have. So if they go on station after having flown hours to get there, drop their weapons within 15 minutes or have an air-to-air engagement within 15 minutes and then have to fly back, you are without air cover until the next group turns up on station. And if it's hours away and it's on a scheduled system, they're going to be hours away, so that's hours of you having no cover. Whereas if you've got an aircraft carrier, you usually have alert fighters and they can be launched immediately. And often the CAP goes to the Combat Air Patrol, that's up in the air. They go to do the intercepts. The alert fighters are launched to replace the CAP on patrol. And then the CAP, after they've carried out their intercept, come back to the carrier to be rearmed and refueled. And if they haven't been flying for too long, they might be made the alert fighters. Or they might be launched again if they think they need to have a double strength CAP up because they think there's going to be enough of a threat situation for them to deal with that. And it's also all this trade and the reasoning that the Washington and London naval treaties had left the Navy unable to have enough forces to protect it all that led the Royal Navy, and not just the Royal Navy, but the US Navy's in some position. I just have the Royal Navy's map here. And even the IJNs, to an extent, navies, in the position of going, we need to have some ideas for how we rapidly grow our carrier numbers. Now, before you start thinking the Royal Navy are, thinking through carriers for anti-submarine warfare, that is part of the Royal Navy's doctrine. They are prepared to use carriers for anti-submarine warfare. Of course, famously, because they don't have other carriers around, they actually use Courageous and Ark Royal at the beginning of World War II and other carriers for anti-submarine warfare, and Courageous gets sunk carrying out. At that point, they remember the reason why in exercises they tended to use Argus and Hermes for this role, and not the full fleet carriers, and also that it's really not something you want to do with fleet carriers, because if the submarine manages to dodge and get past the escorts, you've just lost a very valuable asset. But air power was part of the Royal Navy's doctrine for anti-submarine warfare. It was also part of their doctrine for defense against surface raiders. Now, the really interesting thing with the Royal Navy is that despite this being part of the doctrine, despite them having discussed things like escort carriers, etc., in the 1930s, despite them having worked up ideas and having things for developing, which are rapidly turned into various forms of ships, they hadn't started ordering any when they started ordering the Flowers and the Hunts and all the other war-build escorts. And this can seem really strange. But there is a reason for this, because even in 1939, they're still dealing with a peacetime government. And they are trying desperately to get through the larger fleet carriers and the things which can be coming after the Implacables, etc., into service. If they order escort carriers at this point, they run the risk of someone turning around going, well, you can either have a fleet carrier or the equivalent value of escort carriers. You can't have both. And they couldn't afford to make that decision at that point. Because just like they were planning on building up to 25 capital ships to be able to cover the Indian Ocean, the Mediterranean, and the Atlantic, and the home fleet, and have enough ships at least for each of them. So it's 25, 27. There are very few get in discussion and go, well, their plans were for 24, 25 ships. And I go, yes, but a full squadron's 9 capital ships. If they're going, and they're talking about going back to World War I squadron levels. So it'll be a squadron, a squadron, a squadron for each of the main fleets. And 25 is 2 ships short of that. So they want to get to, they reckon they can get to 25 by 1940. Their plan is to try and get 25 by 1943. I reckon they carry on building up to get to about 27, and then they're really starting to get rid of ships. But leaving that to one side, they've also got plans for fleet carriers and cruisers and all the other things. And I'm fairly sure, considering the amount of studies they put into shipping and ship protection in 20s and 30s, and the continual constant updating of information as to where large merchant ships were. And these are, by the way, these are literally only the merchant ships which are considered large enough and viable enough for wartime utility. That's what they're taking note of. I am absolutely certain some sort of program would have come in. The trouble is, getting that program actually in place in wartime is very, very difficult. But it's not as difficult as getting people to remember the lessons of a major war. Because let's talk about the Falklands War. The Falklands War is, of course, where the Atlantic Conveyor comes to be. And in this period, we do actually have some carriers. We have HMS Hermes and HMS Invincible. And Invincible's the forebear of a full-on class which are coming through. And they are lovely ships. They're not the CVO-1, which the Royal Navy had wanted, but have been cancelled in 1966, based on the grounds that we were always going to be working in wars with NATO allies, and we weren't going to do out-of-area operations, i.e., Britain decided it was going to turn itself into something approximately West Germany in this period strategically, and try and compete for West Germany over who could supply the largest army on the Rhine. Now, many people have made the case quite successfully and succinctly, and to a level that I agree, that in terms of political bargaining power within NATO, the British Army of the Rhine actually was a stronger presence and a stronger capability than having a carrier battle group. I agree entirely in the scenario of NATO. I just disagree when it comes to British strategic interests, and I reckon you probably needed both. I think maintaining a force which had been structured around 3 carrier battle groups, as well as the required escorts, plus some escorts for convoy operations, as well as the British Army of the Rhine, would have been a sensible course to go. But the government decided they couldn't do both and fund all the projects they wanted to do in the UK, most of which were delivered neither on budget nor on time, or in some cases at all. But that is the nature of government projects. It truly is. Especially ones which didn't seem to be delivered were infrastructure ones. Not sure what it is about infrastructure and defence spending, but it's often high-profile, loud announcements and very quiet cancellations. It's littered with them. And that's sad, because a nation needs those things in order to truly grow. Infrastructure might not be necessary with today's volume of usage, but often you are designing it, planning for tomorrow. A tomorrow which may never come, but it's better to have the infrastructure ready for that tomorrow if it does come, than to get to the tomorrow and find your nation and a nation populace strangled by its own infrastructure because it's not ready for it. It truly is. It's kind of like finding yourself in a war scenario, which is not only out of areas, but which your allies aren't coming along, mostly because they have a bit of divided loyalty. One of them there are various scenarios going on, and I'm not going to get into the various different British allies and their relationships with Argentina in 1982 and how this affected the war. That's a whole video in and of itself. And let's be honest, it's a whole video which I would probably have to be very clear about what I suspected, what I've been told by people in passing as rumour from people who are down there, and what is on official reports. It's not something I'm going to do on this channel. It's getting far too political. And far too likely to involve me with needing to set up a legal fund. But with the Falklands War, the big thing about it, the big reality of it, was that Britain's navy was doing an out-of-area operation. Again. Let's be honest, Afghanistan was also an out-of-area operation. The Gulf War was an out-of-area operation. Yes, they were allies, but the whole preconceptions for the CVA-1s being cancelled was they weren't going to, no operations were going to be out of area, and they were all going to be with allies. So, both things. People often treat us, well, it's either one or the other. If we're out of area, it's going to be with allies. No. The criteria was both. So if you have an out-of-area operation with allies or without allies, it doesn't matter. It just means you've contravened both scenarios. And also conversely, if you have an in-area operation but don't have allies involved, it's also broken that criteria. And that's the one that's often missed. The whole idea was, well, tornadoes might be able to provide coverage for the fleet, might be able to provide coverage and air defense for the fleet, but there should be an American carrier or maybe even a French carrier around. We can use them. We can get support from our allies. They bet everything on that, so that they would still look strong, still have the political power, but then need to spend the same amount of money. Didn't need to maintain the infrastructure. Didn't need to maintain the capabilities. Didn't need to run properly the second air force. Because let's be honest, if you have CATABAR carriers, that's catapult assisted takeoff and barrier assisted recovery carriers like the USN and the USN operates and the Charles de Gaulle is. And you have enough of them, it is a second air force. And the British had run theirs for years with Ark Royal and Eagle. But even they had realised that really wasn't enough. They had managed to keep that going by sacrificing a lot of maintenance for Ark Royal and Eagle. And let's be honest, by the end of it they were showing that. You needed to at least have 3 CVO-1s. And if we're honest, there's a reason why after Hermes goes, it's not too long before HMS Ocean is in planning and being constructed. So the Royal Navy ends up with 4 ships. It's kind of like the Royal Navy maintains 4 ballistic missile submarines, like the French do. It guarantees 1 at sea and 1 available for operations. It's almost as if there's something useful about the 4 and when you're operating with warships. Because, let's be honest, warships have a lot of very complicated systems which need to work together, as well as actually work, and which will be required to work in saltwater environments, which will be required to work under high speed, which are required to work when you're subjecting them to all the damage of ongoing operations and training. Firing a missile, firing a gun, having aircraft take off and land, all these things are significant events for a ship. Having to go fast, then go slow, doing rapid turns. All things which merchant ships don't have to do, which is why it's interesting when people try and go, well, we predicted this using our software based on the operation of merchant ships in a similar scenario. What similar scenario is there for a merchant ship to be operating in the same as an aircraft carrier in wartime? Because even those escort carriers, the MAC ships, the CAM ships, and the FCS, they did not operate like an aircraft carrier in wartime. They didn't go to full routine of a fleet carrier. The closest that you really have are some of the operations of Italy during the invasion of Italy, and under the command of Philip Vian, and he's got HMS Unicorn there to support them, and then some of the operations used to support some of the bombardment missions, etc., in the Pacific War. And even then, those ships are specifically not supposed to be doing certain things. I know some of them do end up being attacked by Japanese surface groups, but they're not supposed to be. That's not how the scenario they're supposed to be in. And the vast majority do not go through that kind of experience, should we say. But even with all those decisions and all those scenarios built in, what is interesting is that even the government had been forced by various stark events to A, backpedal on an aviation ship, and I know it goes via the through-deck cruiser, and I know Matthew Wright and others have done the whole digging on these things, and there's a whole debate as to whether or not it is actually called that or isn't called that. All I know is that my dad, who worked on the program, he was a naval architect and is now dead, always said that at one point the program he was on was working on, the naval architects were referring to as the through-deck cruiser because that's what they've been told to call it. So that is my basis for saying it was at some point, at least, using that terminology. It was for a very short amount of time. Because it, to an extent, came out of the cruiser project. They were looking for a helicopter cruiser to replace the Tiger and Blake's, and slowly it grew up into this. And the joke was, well, of the designs, they've gone with the through-deck cruiser design. And even then, they go with the smaller option. There were larger ones to consider, larger versions. The Invincible class are lovely. I'm not going to say they're not. For their size, they are quite lovely. But there were scaled versions which went up to 32,000 tons. The design they chose was 22,000 tons in displacement. What would an extra 10,000 tons have got them? A little bit longer. A little bit longer. And probably a much larger hangar, an air group, and a little bit more space. Maybe they'd have had more than 2 shafts. That's the interesting scenario that some have postulated, that with the extra 10,000 tons growing by 50% in weight, they might well have gained 2 more shafts. 2 more turbo systems and shafts, so they could, how do I put it, go much faster. And be more capable in a wartime survivability scenario. It's an interesting option. They'd certainly have had more hangar space and more space for maintenance. And the thing is, again, this is something I'm going to get into at some point. I'm going to do a video about aircraft carrier design. The difference between a large carrier and a small carrier in terms of utility of space, well, you need the same radar fit. That's the same cost. You need the same command and control systems, pretty much. So that's the same cost. You might have less engines, but then you're going to be slower and maybe less flexible and maybe less survivable. So that is a saving, but it's also a cost in other ways. And you're going to have less space to perform maintenance on aircraft, to carry aircraft, and again, the same as with ship generation, air group to generate fighters. The more aircraft you carry, the more you can generate. If you've got an air group of, let's say, 6 fighters, and one goes wrong, there's a problem with one, you're down to 5. You've lost a major section of your force. If you've got 24 fighters and one goes wrong, you're down to 23. It's annoying, but let's be honest, in terms of force generation, that's not going to worry you as much. If we want easy percentages, I'm going to go with 5 and 25. One goes wrong in 5 aircraft, you've lost 20%. 3 go wrong in 25. You've lost 12% of your force. You can still generate a lot of aircraft. And that's the advantages size gives you. But no, with Invincible, that's their scenario. And Hermes, let's be honest, she was the smallest carrier the Royal Navy had been operating for a long time. Up until the Invincibles, she'd been consistently the smallest vessel within the carriers. That's why she'd been chosen to be the commando carrier. This is why she was considered a good fit for testing out. And yet even she, was still bigger than the Invincibles. Even she was still bigger than the Invincibles. By, curiously enough, 7,000 tons roughly. So 10,000 tons, they would have been bigger than Hermes. Now that would have been interesting. But what is the big problem for both these carriers? Well, when it comes to war, when it comes to Falklands War, they are both sent down, and they are only things that are available. And they are loaded as they can be with what is available at the time. But that's a problem. Despite the best efforts of their air engineers, despite the best efforts of their crews, there is only so much that can be done with the space available. There is only so much that can be carried. And this is what leads to the Atlantic Conveyor, because they need to get more aircraft down to them. And despite having tankers, despite actually having an airfield in Ascension from which aircraft were operating down to the Falklands, they couldn't fly them down. Remember the idea which was talked about aircraft providing air support from land? Interesting enough, at no point in the Falklands War does anyone think, yes, we're trying to operate some tornadoes from Ascension Island to provide air defense for the fleet. No point did they consider that. No point did they consider, let's tank down the Harriers from Ascension to the Falkland Islands. It's just not practical. What they have to do is to take a vessel, the Atlantic Conveyor, and adapt her. And they adapt her in a very rudimentary fashion. She should not really be on this list, because she's not really adapted for anything other than a ferry role. That's what she's for. She's an aircraft ferry. She's not an aircraft carrier. She's carrying the aircraft in a stowed positions, and whilst they can take off and land on her, they really aren't supposed to. There is a fighter kept on deck alert, just in case they get a shadower, but it is kind of like the cam ships. It's going to be interesting, and you might not get more than one chance. And that's a really interesting thing to think about, because this ship is so modern to many eyes, and yet realistically she became a Falklands War version of this, to get the aircraft down. That's what she was. She was a product of necessity because there hadn't been enough investment. She was a product of necessity because the world hadn't changed as much as it was hoped. Everyone was hoping. It's really weird in the Cold War. They go from thinking about there's going to be no war to thinking war is only going to take place in one space in the world, and then the war takes place everywhere else. And it really does take place everywhere else. It's a really interesting thing in a Cold War scenario. It's very rare you get the direct conflict that people fear and people dread and people talk about. It's more often you get proxy wars and involvement in proxy wars, and each side trying to deny they're taking part, and then acting distraught if they lost, or turning up with massive overwhelming force to try and prevent losing. And a constant war with their own publics about maintaining morale and focus. It's a joyous period of history. In the Falklands War, though, the Conveyor is mostly remembered for her loss, for the fact that she wasn't as important as the carriers and was placed up threat from them. Not as something which was supposed to deal with the enemy threat. Basically, the options were, well, we hope to deal with the enemy threat by fighters, but we've got no airborne early warning, so it's dependent on Type 42s if they're working and they spot the aircraft long enough away to vector in the Sea Harriers. If they don't, and then they do pick them up, then it's the Sea Dart missiles, which we'll be using, which Invincible himself carried as well, and also used at several points. And if that doesn't work, then it's hoped the Sea Wolves and the Sea Slugs and the Sea Cat missiles will all work, and if that doesn't work, then we've got a load of electronic countermeasures and we've got guns, and if that doesn't work, well, then there are going to be these line of large ships. They're not put in danger's way on purpose. They're not put in danger at all. The old plan was the only thing safer than them would be the actual carriers themselves. They're that far into the areas of defences. And, to be fair, that reflects their importance. It was similar for cam ships. It was similar for all those ships. They were important because when you don't have any options, that's what you have to do. And one of the things you're accepting when you're using civilian ships for these roles is that they are going to have less in the way of damage control. They're going to have less in the way of survivability, less in the way of the ability to take and deal out damage. And so you've got to adjust for that versus a warship. They're not going to have the same level of subdivision. That is all. Those are all things you have to adjust for. But still, she delivered her Harriers. The important thing she needed to deliver, she delivered her Harriers. There is a lot worse. Yeah, she gets off quite a few of her helicopters. She doesn't get all her helicopters off. She doesn't get all her spare parts off. That's more of a problem. She doesn't get all the supplies she's carrying with her off. But she did deliver her Harriers. I would love to say that we learn from our past mistakes. I would love to say anyone does it. But tonight, we have HMS Queen Elizabeth and HMS Prince of Wales in the UK. The Americans have not announced what they're going to be doing after they built the current run of 4 class. My suggestion, my preference would be for just continuing on the construction program. Yes, it'd be nice for them to have more carriers and grow carriers, but let's be honest, if you consider the track record with the destroyer program and various other things, there is a reason why Keep Building Arleigh Burkes has had to be the way forward. Every time they're looking to something new, the project becomes hung with so many boondoggles and so many baubles and so many this, that, and the other from Senate and all the other layers of government involved in procurement that the thing ends up going either full buckaroo donkey and being useless, or just gets crushed under the weight. So, yeah, it probably is better to just keep building the forts. For most other nations today, the lesson of history has constantly been, since the end of World War I, really, that attempts to try and pass off responsibility for defence and security to a treaty, to an alliance, only works if you're prepared to put what is necessary into it. You see, the thing is, what's often forgotten about the treaties is that, in terms of anti-submarine warfare, you could build as many sloops as you wanted. Those were vessels under 2,000 tons, under 20 knots top speed, not armed with torpedoes, and not armed with that many large guns, but perfectly fine for anti-submarine warfare. You could build as many of those as you wanted without infringing on the treaty in any way, shape, or form. Did any power do that? No, not a single one. Britain built a fair number, but nowhere near the number it would need in a wartime. You must be kidding me, if you think that. You get out from these things what you put in. And you get out also what you put in that suits you. You have to work out, when you're in an alliance, what areas of your security does an alliance cover, and what does it not cover. If the alliance doesn't cover, let's say, part of your territory, and there's been things recently made about Hawaii for America, and let's be honest, America's the major part of NATO. Most of the reason why NATO works is because if you attack one of the other members, one of the people who's going to come to their aid is America. So the whole idea of, oh, Hawaii's not covered by NATO, we can attack that and it's going to be fine, is really a big joke. But we'll leave that to one side. Also, there is a small lesson from history about what happens when you attack Hawaii. I'm not going to make a joke out of it, but there is a lesson from history about what happens if you attack Hawaii. Just going to just put that out there. But it's the same with the Falklands. It's the same with lots of territories. And you have to decide what the level of risk or you are going to take as a nation for that. Whether you're going to retain the capabilities you need for that kind of operation. Whether you're going to retain the amphibious ships you need. Whether you're going to retain the carriers you need. The submarines you need. The escorts you need. Whether they're destroyers, frigates, cruisers. It doesn't matter what they are. Are you going to retain them? Are you going to operate them? Are you going to build them? Are you going to crew them? And what's most humorous about all of this that's gone on, and I have to say this is a good example of the Atlantic Conveyor, etc. If again I bring up those lovely ships from the Royal Navy, the fighter capital ships. One of those was HMS Pegasus, which was an in-service ship, which was converted. There were a lot of ships which the Royal Navy considered for the role, which had been ships decommissioned or put in ordinary. Most of the W-class and V-class destroyers, which were used in World War II for convoy escorts, had been ships in ordinary. And this is the other fun when people talk about building a modern Flower class. What they're really forgetting is that the Flower class weren't on their own. They were being better. There was an entire utility of older ships which were converted to purpose, which bought much necessary time until the Flower class were available. And this is despite the fact the Flower class were designed in 1938 and were being ordered in 1939, months before war began, along with the Hunt class escort destroyers. They're not wartime emergency builds, they're ordered before the war began. But they were predicated, and their time to allow them to get in service was predicated on the armed forces having a large reserve of ships. A large reserve of ships which had mostly been built up in a period before treaties, when defence procurement had been about what your nation needed to defend its interests and its needs. I would love to say the politicians of the 1900s and 1910s and then 1890s and those periods of Victorian era and the early Edwardian era were far more able to face tough decisions and have tough answers, but really they weren't. It's just the way they parked and fudged the answers were differently. These days it's parked and fudged in the cheapest way possible. Committee meetings, and oh, we're a member of an alliance, so we're going to have a meeting with our allies. In the 1900s and the 1890s and 1910s, what did the government do? They've ordered some ships. The decision might really be, do you need new heavy artillery for the army? Do you need to invest? What do you need? And what does the sort of amphibious shipping do you need for the army? What kind of ships do you need for the navy? But no, what they'll do is to just order something. Oh, we're ordering some ships, because that was the cheapest way out of it. And those ships weren't always that good, but they were always something. They weren't necessarily good, but they were definitely very rarely bad either. And there's a big difference in that, because between bad and good, there's still useful. And still useful is, well, useful. A lot of the rapid conversions that we've seen in aviation support terms for fleet operations in World War II and in the Falklands War and in World War One are a product of timing. World War One, it's the newness of seaplane carriers. You haven't time enough to build enough into the Navy. The Royal Navy's already built HMS Ark Royal, which was the first purpose-built one. But realistically, they've got plans for a better designs and they're trying to learn it, when war comes and they suddenly need to grow everything massively. And quite a lot of the yards which would have been building something were actually building things like monitors. And sloops. The Flagler-class sloops. In the interwar years, there are treaties which are restricting things, which means you can't build enough. The Royal Navy is even prepared to accept smaller carriers than it can build in maximum, so try and get enough fleet carriers that are useful. Not necessarily what their dream carrier would be, not necessarily what they'd want their carrier to be, but are useful enough and can do the job they need them to be able to do. And then in the Cold War, one of the longest periods of sustained investment in defense spending, if you look at the graphs. Even in that period, the funding doesn't necessarily go where it needs to go. Because the debate has changed. And that probably sounds like a muddled answer, but it isn't. So, because I'm going to finish with one last thought for you to consider, and a question, as I always finish these videos with a question. The reason I say the debate has changed is that the metrics that we use to discuss defence and procurement have changed. This is why these ships have come up. This is why these ships have appeared. Because by changing the debate, the governments have changed what they need to deliver. And by changing what they need to deliver, they've managed to avoid having to deliver anything. It's far easier to announce a committee, a programme, and a meeting of allies than it is to actually order something, make a decision, and potentially be right or wrong. Being wrong is always worse. But being right can be just as problematic, because the question can then be asked, well, if you were right to order that, why didn't you order more? Or why did you wait till then to order them? Or why didn't you say that when you did your SDSR or whatever you're talking about in terms of defence reviews? And so here is the question. In the 1920s and 30s, and in the 1900s, and before World War I, it was quite common for merchant ships to be built with hardpoints. Funding was given by the government in order for those ships to be ready to be easily converted into armed merchant cruisers in wartime. In Japan's case, some of those ships were able to be converted into escort carriers in wartime. Now, whilst recognising the difficulty of doing such things today, when the vast majority of merchant ships are not built within the countries which operate them, they're not even necessarily flagged in the countries that operate them, and goodness knows me, the merchant fleets have shrunk dramatically for every single nation, to an extent that I would seriously worry in a Falklands War scenario whether Britain would be able to take up enough ships from trade. Do you think, considering the proliferation of drones and other systems, which has, the phrase usually uses democratized war, but I would say just added range and capability. It's taken grenade-sized explosives, which were always pretty annoying, and made them slightly more powerful, but also given them far more range, and taken it from an RPG to a remote-controlled system. Given these democratizations of firepower in wartime, do you think it should be part of government incentivization with merchant ships? Or should it be a requirement from governments? But I think if you make it a requirement that government and merchant ships be able to be fitted with some sort of electronic countermeasures and maybe be required to carry them as standard to an extent, and be fitted with, be able to be fitted with things like close-in weapon systems, etc. Even if you want to integrate them by just tacking on a container, so they need to have the positions that can take the containers in those kinds of positions and support those containerized systems there. And you will need the idea of a completely self-contained container is a nice idea, but in reality, if you want the system to function at most effectiveness, it needs to be able to tie itself into the ship's systems in some regards. Certainly the ship's positioning data, etc., and the ship's navigational data need to be available for it to properly adjust itself. I think if you make that a requirement from any flag, then even if you make it an alliance-wide requirement, you might well find numerous ship owners pointing out, well, we technically are residents of this country which doesn't have the requirement, and the ship's flagged in this country which doesn't have that requirement, so yeah, we don't have to do that. So ultimately, as the stick would probably fail, you're left with the carrot as the only option. So should they be incentivized to do this? Would it be sensible preparations for future realities? Or rather, potential future realities. Realities we really hope to avoid, but it's always better to hope to avoid them and prepare for them than to hope to avoid them and find them crashing down around your ears along the rest of your world. Anyway, thank you very much for watching. Hope you enjoyed, hope you found it interesting, and I know it's slightly different from a normal video on this topic, but this one was always going to be slightly different. And it was always going to be slightly more of a once its conception, operation, and conclusion. Notice, not construction. It was always going to be slightly different. Next week is going to be the French Naval Aircraft Squadron System. He says hoping he hasn't packed the book he had for that. I don't think I have, but wish me luck. Thank you very much for watching. If you liked the video, please like, share, and subscribe. It would be really, really kind of you. And maybe considering becoming a patron and suggesting topics for June, or Ko-fi, or all the other things, if you would like to support my book habit. And well, the book habit is really taking over. Surprisingly, though, it wasn't books which actually hurt me in this move so far. He says so far. The book pile's getting taller, and I do sit in front of it, so there's always chances.